Now this is a recent comment made by one Mark Minch on one of my Spider-Man videos. I responded to this on YouTube, but later I thought I should give it some more in-depth consideration and go into it at length. Mark, I won't go into a rant here, but I'll go into some detail about why I wrote this mega essay in the first place. Yes, I have seen Peter's video. Peter is Southpaw, by the way. No, my video is not necessarily arguing against his criticisms, so much as I'm making the point that such criticisms are not taking the medium at face value. So Peter isn't necessarily wrong, but his approach is wrong-headed. The way it goes is something like this. Let's say Peter said Superman can't fly because flight doesn't work that way. Well, I'd respond to that by saying Superman can't fly because Superman does not exist. He's not real. So in this manner, I would not be directly telling him that he's wrong, but what I would be saying is that he's approaching the medium in a manner that does not acknowledge what the medium is. Peter's criticism is aimed at the practicality of any number of details within any particular scene in Spider-Man 2. But this has no merit because most of what this amounts to is just picking and choosing what one does or does not think is realistic, or coincides with whatever one's vision is about what internal logic should or should not be. And while one does this, there's an assumed limitation to what the movie is or is not allowed to do. The problem with Peter's criticism is that limitation is never put forward. So during the entire video, one begs the question, where is the line drawn? There's no standard. Now, just so all is fair, I will admit that I've engaged in this type of criticism myself. I directed it at such aspects as the fact that Otto's arms are taken for granted by the audience in his lab. The arms are treated as being a mere appliance when by all means they are a miraculous invention in and of themselves. Nevertheless, at the same time, I can accept that the film is not placing practical importance on these arms. The arms are a symbol. They're a symbol of power. Peter Parker's spider abilities are also a symbol of power. Norman Osborn's Green Goblin abilities and his tech, those are also symbols of power. In fact, much of what constitutes the wide-ranging abilities boasted by any superhero in any superhero film is that it amounts to a fancy, symbolic representation of will to power. Now, Sam Raimi wants his audience to engage in a more poetic vision of what all these things are. And so we get all these moments throughout the movie where the mechanical arms seem to defy their actual depicted length. And beyond the blades that he has embedded within his arms, there are also smaller snake-like appendages that are projected from them. Ultimately, much of what the arms can or cannot do is very plot-specific, but that is intentional. Now, what Peter wants to do is assume that the writers are being inconsistent or illogical. But the fact of the matter is, it's purposeful. We're not meant to perceive the arms in a manner that coincides with reality. The arms are symbolic. Now, I call it demonic possession, but can further say that they indicate the corrupting influence of power. Now, that poetic vision is further extended to Peter Parker, and as I say in my essay, we're not given any definitive answer by the movie as to why Peter Parker loses his powers, but based on the information we are given, much can be implied. But for sure we can say that the loss is not subject to the rules of real-life genetic mutation. Genetic material does not simply change its format based on whether or not we're having a bad day at work, for example. In that sense, we're not meant to look at Peter Parker's powers as being genetically endowed here. Instead, Spider-Man 2 engages in a more spiritual perspective about his powers, which in turn defies all sense of practicality. What that means is that if Peter, Southpaw, is sticking to his guns, and he wants to look at the movie from a purely practical perspective, then the entire movie falls apart from that standpoint. In other words, the main driving force of the movie doesn't work from a practical perspective. So again, if Peter, Southpaw, wants to say the movie is illogical or impractical, yeah, I'll agree, wholeheartedly. But then again, from that same perspective, the entire concept of Spider-Man is illogical. Yet we do have an audience that readily engages in the medium because we are not watching the movie or even reading the comic books because we necessarily expect there to be a standard of realism. One final note here is with regard to the title of Peter's video, Spider-Man 2 is far from great. To be frank, this is what irks people the most because this is essentially clickbait. This is meant to get under your skin, Mark. You see, Peter is not fostering any discussion that seeks to understand the medium in question. Instead, what he's essentially doing here is trying to start a fight. He does this on Twitter as well. That's largely what Twitter is for, picking fights and then throwing quips at your opposition. There's no real intellectual discussion going on. Now, what this inevitably results in is a gradual sway from any sophisticated approach towards the artistic medium, and people just resort to canceling or excommunicating opposing sides to their views. Hearts become hardened. If you're in a room where everyone wants to be regarded as being the smartest there is, the ones who are wisest are first to take their leave. Because the situation will eventually amount to nothing more than children pushing and shoving each other at the playground. God forbid anyone engage in any amount of humility nowadays. The quality of Spider-Man 2 is not necessarily tied to the movie's adherence to practicality or internal logic. If that is Peter's presupposition, then he needs to justify it. Otherwise, it is just another unsubstantiated opinion.